March 15, 1962, 9:15 p.m., the rooftop of a brownstone on 125th Street in Harlem was silent, except for the whisper of wind cutting through the cold March night. Two men stood in the darkness, and only one of them would leave with his life intact. Bumpy Johnson's hands were steady. His face was calm, peaceful even, like a man contemplating a sunset rather than contemplating death. The other man, a young hustler named Raymond Cross, 28 years old, with the kind of jumpy energy that came from fear and too much cocaine, was sweating through his shirt despite the cold. Behind Raymond stood two of Bumpy's lieutenants, their silhouettes framed against the Manhattan skyline, but they kept their distance. This conversation needed to be private. Bumpy had learned long ago that the most powerful moments were the ones witnessed by the fewest people. Raymond's hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep them at his sides. He knew what was coming. He'd known for 3 weeks, ever since the night he pulled the trigger on Marcus Webb, ever since the moment the bullet left his gun and found Marcus in the chest, ever since he watched his oldest friend in the world fall to the pavement, bleeding out on 116th Street. Marcus Webb had been like a brother to Bumpy Johnson. Not a brother in the way men casually use that word. Not a casual connection forged through business or circumstance. Marcus had been with Bumpy since 1947, through every war, every police raid, every moment when the city tried to break Bumpy's grip on Harlem. Marcus was the man Bumpy trusted with his life. And Raymond Cross, this sweating kid standing in front of him on a rooftop in the darkness, had put a bullet in him over a debt that couldn't have been more than $300. $300. That was the price of Marcus Webb's life. That was what it had cost Raymond to pull the trigger and destroy everything Bumpy had built around loyalty and trust. The absurdity of it haunted Bumpy every waking moment. Marcus had been a good man in a world that didn't reward good men. Marcus had been honest in a business built on lies. Marcus had been kind when kindness was weakness. And yet somehow he'd survived longer than men, twice as ruthless, because Bumpy had protected him, had made sure that the rules of his world extended protection to his oldest friend. And now Marcus was dead, and Raymond Cross was standing in front of him. And Bumpy had to figure out what justice looked like when it came to this moment. This conversation that would define him as much as it would define Raymond. Bumpy had been furious when he found out. He'd been angry in a way his associates had never seen before. Bumpy Johnson didn't get angry often. Anger was for men who couldn't think clearly, and Bumpy needed to think clearly to survive. But on that night, when someone told him that Marcus was dead, that his oldest friend had been shot down like a dog on the street, something in Bumpy had broken. His office above Small's Paradise had rattled with his rage. He'd overturned a desk, smashed a mirror with his bare hand, and his men had scattered like birds, none of them wanting to be in the same room when Bumpy Johnson's control finally snapped. The office had erupted in the kind of fury that reminds men why they're afraid of their boss, why they follow orders without question, why they understand that Bumpy Johnson is not a man to cross. But after that initial eruption, after the rage had burned through his system like a fever, Bumpy had gone quiet. He'd sat in his office for hours, staring out the window at Harlem spreading below him, at the streets he'd fought to protect, at the people he'd made promises to, and he'd realized something that changed everything about how he would handle this situation. The word went out that night, but it didn't go out the way people expected. Usually when Bumpy said he wanted someone, that someone disappeared into the East River with their shoes filled with concrete, but this time was different. This time Bumpy let it be known that he wanted Raymond Cross brought to him alive. He wanted him intact. He wanted to have a conversation. That's what confused everyone. Men in Bumpy's position didn't usually want conversations with people who'd murdered their best friends. Men in his position wanted vengeance, wanted to send a message, wanted to make sure that everyone in Harlem understood that killing someone close to Bumpy came with the ultimate price. But Bumpy's order was clear, and his men followed it without question, even though they didn't understand it, even though they whispered among themselves about whether Bumpy was losing his touch, whether the death of Marcus had affected him so badly that he wasn't thinking straight anymore. It took 3 weeks to find Raymond Cross. He'd tried to run, tried to disappear into the system, tried to use connections with some dealers from the Bronx who owed him favors. But there was no place in New York where Bumpy Johnson's reach didn't extend. Bumpy owned cops. Bumpy owned judges. Bumpy owned enough of the city's infrastructure that hiding from him was like trying to hide from gravity. It was futile. It was pointless. It was a matter of time before the net closed in. When they found Raymond, he'd been living in a cheap hotel on Amsterdam Avenue, registered under a fake name, drinking whiskey straight from the bottle, barely eating, barely sleeping. His mind had been eating him alive. Guilt, fear, regret, all of it mixing together in his nervous system until he was barely functional. He'd lost 30 pounds in 3 weeks. His skin was gray. His eyes had that hollow look of a man whose conscience was slowly destroying him from the inside out. The thing was, Raymond had known Marcus first not well, but they'd run in the same circles, had seen each other around the neighborhood, had exchanged words on the street. Raymond had actually liked Marcus, had respected him in that way. You respect someone who's clearly better than you are, who's operating on a higher moral plane than you could ever reach. Marcus had given Raymond money once when Raymond was sick and broke, had helped him get to a hospital, had sat with him while he was recovering. And then one night, because of $300 and too much cocaine and a gun in his hand, Raymond had killed the only man in his life who'd ever shown him genuine kindness without expecting anything in return. Bumpy's men had been gentle when they brought him in. They hadn't beaten him, they hadn't threatened him. They'd simply appeared at his door, made it clear that this was the end of running, and transported him to the brownstone on 125th Street. One of them had even offered him water during the ride. Another had told him that Bumpy just wanted to talk, that Raymond didn't need to be afraid, that violence wasn't coming, at least not immediately. But those words had made Raymond more afraid, not less, because he understood that if Bumpy was going to kill him, Bumpy would have done it already. If Bumpy was going to take revenge, it would have been swift and brutal and quick. The fact that Bumpy wanted to talk, the fact that Bumpy was taking his time, the fact that Bumpy was bringing Raymond to a rooftop in the middle of the night meant that something worse was happening, something more terrible than a quick death. And that understanding had been eating Raymond alive for the 3 hours between his capture and this moment. Now, on that rooftop in the darkness, with the city lights glittering below them like 1,000 eyes watching, Raymond Cross stood trembling before the man whose friend he'd murdered. Bumpy looked at Raymond for a long time without speaking. He studied him the way a scientist might study an insect under glass, curious, detached, trying to understand the mechanisms that made this creature tick. Raymond was waiting for violence. He'd spent 3 weeks expecting pain, expecting his punishment to be swift and brutal. He'd imagined being beaten, shot, thrown off this very rooftop. He'd prepared himself for death in 100 different ways, had mentally rehearsed his final moments 1,000 times, had tried to come to terms with the fact that he was about to pay the ultimate price for his crime. But Bumpy just looked at him. That was worse than violence. That was the moment Raymond realized that Bumpy Johnson was going to do something worse than kill him. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, like something you could reach out and touch. Bumpy's lieutenants stood by the door, smoking cigarettes, looking out at the city, deliberately not watching this moment. They'd been told to give Bumpy privacy, and they understood that meant genuine privacy, not surveillance, not eavesdropping, not bearing witness. Whatever was about to happen on this rooftop was between Bumpy Johnson and Raymond Cross, and it was a conversation that needed to exist in the space between them, undisturbed and unobserved. When Bumpy finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that Raymond almost couldn't hear it, had to lean forward to catch the words, and in leaning forward, he made himself vulnerable, made himself open to the emotion that was about to wash over him. "Tell me about Marcus," Bumpy said. The words fell between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread out and touched everything. Raymond's eyes went wide. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He didn't know what he was supposed to say. "What, Bumpy?" "No, you heard me. Tell me about my friend. Tell me about Marcus Webb." "I don't," Raymond started, but Bumpy held up a hand and Raymond's words died in his throat like a bird shot out of the sky. "You're going to tell me?" Bumpy continued, his voice still that quiet, dangerous whisper that carried more weight than any shout could have. "You're going to tell me about the man you killed? You're going to tell me who he was? You're going to tell me what you took from this world when you pulled that trigger? You're going to describe to me the life that you ended, the possibilities that you destroyed, the people you left behind? And you're going to do it because I need to hear it from your mouth, because I need to understand how a man can know another man, can receive kindness from another man, and then decide that man's life is worth less than a debt of $300. Raymond's voice came out small, broken, like something had shattered inside him. "I didn't mean to do it," he said. The gun went off. It was an accident. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. He knew that Bumpy didn't believe him. He knew that everyone on that rooftop understood that accidental deaths don't happen this way. That you don't accidentally put 3 bullets into someone's chest. That you don't accidentally pull a trigger 3 separate times and call it an accident. An accident? Bumpy repeated the word slowly, as if tasting it, as if considering whether he believed it. You accidentally put 3 bullets in my friend? You accidentally murdered Marcus Webb? You had your gun in your hand, and you accidentally pointed it at him? And you accidentally pulled the trigger, and 3 bullets accidentally left your gun and accidentally found their way into his body? Those were all accidents, Raymond. Is that what you're telling me? No, Bumpy said, shaking his head. I don't think that's right. I think what happened is that you made a choice. You made a series of choices that led to that moment on 116th Street. You chose to carry a gun. You chose to pull it out when Marcus told you he didn't have your money. You chose to point it at him, and then you chose to pull the trigger. Not once, but 3 times. Those weren't accidents. Those were choices. Own your choices, Raymond. Look at me and tell me what you did. Raymond's legs were giving out. He sank to his knees on the rooftop concrete, the rough surface scraping his skin, drawing small drops of blood that went unnoticed in the darkness. I shot him, Raymond whispered. I shot Marcus. I killed him. Yes, Bumpy said. And now tell me why. Why did you kill my friend? Because of money? Raymond choked out. $300. He owed me $300, and I asked him for it, and he said he didn't have it yet. He'd have it next week. And I got angry. I got so angry. And I had my gun. I had my gun right there on my hip, and I just pulled the trigger. He was still talking, still explaining, still trying to justify what he'd done. But the words were coming out as sobs now. As gasping breaths that made his whole body convulse with the weight of what he was admitting. The story poured out of Raymond in broken pieces. He talked about how he'd been dealing drugs with Marcus's connection, how he was desperate to prove himself, how he'd borrowed money from some serious people and needed to repay it quickly. He talked about how Marcus had been sympathetic but had said he didn't have the money right then, that he could get it in a week, maybe 2. He talked about how Raymond had interpreted that as a refusal, as a betrayal, as Marcus choosing his own situation over helping Raymond in his crisis. He talked about the anger that had bubbled up, the sense that he'd been wronged, that Marcus owed him more than he was willing to give. And he talked about the gun, about how he'd been carrying it for protection, how it had felt heavy on his hip, how he'd thought about showing it to Marcus, about using it to intimidate him into finding the money faster. But he'd never thought he'd actually use it. He'd never actually believed he would pull the trigger. Right up until the moment he did, right up until the gun was in his hand and he was pointing it at Marcus and his finger was tightening on the trigger. Raymond had believed that this was just a show of force, just a way to get Marcus's attention, just a way to make him understand how serious Raymond's situation was. And then the gun had gone off, and there was an explosion of noise and chaos, and Marcus was falling. And Raymond was standing there staring at what he'd done, and then the gun had gone off again, and again. And Marcus was on the ground, and blood was pooling around him, and people were screaming, and Raymond was running, was always running, and had been running ever since. Bumpy knelt down in front of him, and this is the moment that nobody expected. This is the moment that would be told and retold in Harlem for years to come, the moment that would define what people understood about true strength and true power. Bumpy reached out and he wiped a tear from Raymond's cheek. Not roughly, gently, the way someone might comfort a child who'd had a nightmare. And Bumpy Johnson began to tell Raymond Cross about Marcus Webb. He told him about 1947, when Marcus had first come to Harlem from Philadelphia, when he'd been young and lost and didn't know how to survive in a city that chewed people up and spit them out. He told him about how he'd met Marcus in a numbers joint, how Marcus had been working as a runner, how he'd been good at his job because he actually cared about the people he was running numbers for, because he understood that these were poor people making small bets that represented hope, represented a possible escape from their lives. Bumpy told him about how Marcus had stood beside him against the most powerful forces in New York. He told him about the time when Dutch Schultz's old crew had tried to muscle in on Harlem, about how there had been a war on the streets that had lasted 3 months and had claimed lives on both sides. He told him about how Marcus had never wavered, had never suggested they negotiate or back down, had been there every single day, ready to fight, ready to bleed, ready to die for the neighborhood they were trying to protect. He told him about the time Marcus had taken a knife wound meant for Bumpy, had bled in an alley for 2 hours before they got him to a doctor. And when Bumpy had offered to give him money to disappear, to start a new life somewhere safe, somewhere away from this world of violence and danger, Marcus had refused. Marcus had said that he wasn't going anywhere, that loyalty meant something, that a man who abandoned his people in a crisis wasn't a man at all. Marcus had said that he'd stay in Harlem, that he'd keep fighting, and that if he died doing it, at least he died doing something that mattered. He told Raymond about the time Bumpy's mother had gotten sick, back in 1953, about how the cancer had been eating her alive from the inside, about how the doctors had said she had maybe 6 months, and about how Marcus had sat at her bedside for 3 days straight without leaving even once. Marcus had held her hand and talked to her about the old days in the South, about the life she'd lived before she came to New York, about the good memories and the good people she'd known. Marcus had made her laugh, even as the pain was overwhelming her, even as she was slipping away. Marcus had stayed with her through the night, had held her when she cried, had been the kind of friend that most people only read about in books or saw in movies. When Bumpy's mother had finally passed, it was Marcus who had washed her body, who had helped prepare her for the funeral, who had stood beside Bumpy at the grave and had simply been there, present and steady and unchanging. He told Raymond about all the times Marcus had been there, had been steady, had been the kind of friend that can only come along once in a lifetime, if you're lucky. He told him about how Marcus had never asked for anything in return, how Marcus had never used his friendship with Bumpy as leverage, how Marcus had never suggested that Bumpy owed him anything. Marcus had simply been present. Marcus had simply shown up. Marcus had simply been good in a way that was almost unheard of in the world they inhabited. And as Bumpy told these stories, as he painted this portrait of Marcus Webb, Raymond Cross wept like his heart was breaking. Not the kind of crying that comes from fear or self-pity, but the kind of crying that comes from suddenly understanding what you've destroyed, from seeing the magnitude of what you've taken from the world, from comprehending that the man you killed was irreplaceable and good and genuinely one of the best people that Harlem had to offer. Bumpy sat back on his heels and looked at Raymond for a long moment, studying his face, watching the realization wash over him like a wave. He could see the moment when Raymond truly understood what he'd done, when it stopped being abstract and became real, when the $300 faded away and the only thing left was the knowledge that he'd murdered someone who was innocent of any real crime, someone who had only tried to help him, someone who had asked for just a little more time and hadn't deserved what he got in response. Then Bumpy spoke, and his voice was different now. There was no anger in it, no rage. What he said was somehow worse than any threat he could have made, was more devastating than any violence could have been. Do you know what the worst part is, Raymond? The worst part is that I could kill you right now, and it wouldn't change anything. I could put a bullet in you, throw your body in the river, and Marcus would still be dead. All the punishment in the world wouldn't bring him back. All the pain I could inflict on you wouldn't undo what you did. All the blood I could spill wouldn't restore what you've taken. That's what makes this so hard. That's what makes you understand that some things can't be fixed. Some things can only be lived with. Some things can only be carried like a weight that never gets lighter, that never gets easier to bear. Raymond was barely breathing now. His whole body was racked with sobs, with the kind of deep, primal sobbing that comes from the realization of irreversible damage. From understanding that you've done something that can never be undone, that you've crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, I'm so sorry." The words came out like prayers, like desperate pleas to a God who wasn't listening, to a universe that didn't care about his regret. Bumpy let him cry. He didn't try to comfort him anymore. He didn't try to ease his pain. He just sat there and let Raymond understand fully and completely what he had done. Bumpy stood up after several minutes and walked to the edge of the rooftop. He looked out over Harlem, over the city he'd fought so hard to protect, over all the people who depended on him to keep the balance, to enforce the rules, to make sure that actions had consequences. The city stretched out below them, indifferent to the human drama happening on this rooftop, indifferent to the loss of one good man, indifferent to the destruction of one damaged man who'd just realized what he'd destroyed. Bumpy could see the street where Marcus had died, could imagine the scene, could feel the weight of it in his chest. He'd thought he understood pain, thought he understood loss, but nothing had prepared him for losing Marcus. Nothing had prepared him for a world where Marcus Webb no longer existed. When he turned back to Raymond, there was something in his eyes that might have been sadness, might have been regret, might have been something that transcended the usual categories of human emotion. Bumpy walked over to his lieutenants and whispered something to them. They stepped back inside, gave Bumpy and Raymond a few more minutes alone. The conversation that followed was quiet, was brief, but it contained more weight than any words spoken loudly could have contained. Bumpy told Raymond that he was going to give him a choice. He told Raymond that he could kill him right now, could make him disappear, could make this entire situation go away with one phone call and one bullet. Or Raymond could accept the punishment that Bumpy was about to offer him, a punishment that would last far longer than death ever could. Bumpy's lieutenants brought Raymond to his feet, held him steady even as his legs trembled and threatened to give out completely. Bumpy pointed toward the door that led back into the building. "Take him downtown," Bumpy said, "to the precinct. We're going to turn him in. We're going to walk into the police station, and we're going to tell them exactly what happened. You killed Marcus Webb over $300. There are 100 witnesses who saw it happen. You shot him down on the street like a dog. They're all going to testify. You're going to face trial, you're going to go to prison, and you're going to stay there for a long, long time. Maybe 20 years, maybe 30. Maybe the rest of your life." Raymond's head snapped up. "What, you heard me?" Bumpy said calmly. "We're going to walk into the police station and we're going to turn you in. But here's the thing, Raymond. If I didn't turn you in, if I let you go right now, if I just let you disappear into the world, the Italians would find you eventually. The Russian mob would find you eventually. Someone would find you eventually. And they wouldn't be as merciful as I am. They'd kill you quickly. They wouldn't care about justice. They'd just care about sending a message. So, in a strange way, prison is your salvation. Prison is your only chance at redemption, at understanding what you've done, at maybe, just maybe, becoming something other than a murderer. Prison is worse than death for a man like you," Bumpy said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made Raymond's knees buckle again. "In prison, you'll have nothing but time and your thoughts. You'll have years and years to understand the magnitude of what you took from this world. You'll have decades to think about Marcus, to think about the kindness he showed you, to think about how different everything could have been if you just waited 1 week, just 1 week, for him to get you that money. Every single day, you'll wake up in a cell, and you'll know that Marcus is gone. You'll know that he's not coming back. You'll know that it's your fault, and you'll have to live with that. That's your punishment, Raymond." That's how Bumpy Johnson decided to handle the man who killed his best friend. They walked Raymond Cross down the stairs, out into the Harlem night, and toward the police precinct. It was past midnight when they arrived, and the streets were nearly empty. A few people saw them walking, and word began to spread immediately. Bumpy Johnson was turning someone in. Bumpy Johnson was walking into a police station with someone in custody. Bumpy Johnson wasn't taking revenge. Bumpy Johnson was taking something else entirely. It wasn't violence. It wasn't death. It was something that would last far longer than a quick murder could ever last. The police officers at the precinct didn't know what to do when Bumpy Johnson walked in with Raymond Cross in tow. They'd never seen anything like it before. Bumpy was Harlem's king, was the man the NYPD wanted to destroy, was the man they'd tried to arrest 100 times and never managed to make anything stick. And yet here he was, delivering someone to them, turning someone over to the system, helping them make an arrest. The officers took Raymond into custody without a word. Bumpy gave them the information they'd need, told them about the witnesses, told them that this was the murder of Marcus Webb, told them that Raymond had confessed. Then Bumpy turned around and walked back out into the night, leaving Raymond in the hands of the police. The trial took 3 months. All the witnesses testified. Raymond Cross didn't fight the charges. He didn't hire a fancy lawyer. He stood up in court and he told the truth. He told them exactly what had happened, exactly how he'd killed Marcus Webb, exactly why he'd done it. The jury found him guilty in less than an hour of deliberation. The judge sentenced him to 28 years in prison. Raymond didn't appeal. Raymond didn't fight the sentence. He simply accepted it, understanding that it was the consequence he deserved, understanding that he was getting exactly what Bumpy had promised him would happen. Word spread through Harlem like electricity through a wire as the trial was happening and as the verdict came down. Bumpy Johnson didn't take revenge. Bumpy Johnson took justice, but it was a different kind of justice than anyone in Harlem had ever seen before. It was the kind of justice that showed everyone that Bumpy understood something deeper than just violence. It was justice that was rooted in consequence and understanding and the weight of what you'd done. It was justice that forced a man to face himself every single day for the rest of his life, that made him understand that he couldn't run from what he'd done, that made him carry the weight of his crime forever. The story of how Bumpy Johnson handled Marcus Webb's murder spread through Harlem and then through New York and then beyond, spreading like a lesson that people needed to understand. It became something different than people expected. It became a meditation on what real strength looks like. It became a meditation on the difference between revenge and justice. It became something that changed the way people thought about power and punishment forever. Men who heard the story understood that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. Bumpy Johnson was something more. Bumpy Johnson was a philosopher with a gun on his hip. Bumpy Johnson was a man who understood humanity better than most people could ever hope to understand it. The five families heard about what happened, and they understood it immediately. They understood that Bumpy Johnson was demonstrating something to them as much as he was demonstrating something to Harlem. He was showing them that he didn't need to use violence to be powerful. He was showing them that he could take a situation where violence seemed inevitable and transform it into something entirely different. He was showing them that he could control the narrative, control the outcome, control everything, without raising his voice or firing a shot. It was a message that echoed through the underworld. It was a lesson that changed the way organized crime operated in New York. The story of Raymond Cross became legendary. People told it in barbershops and on street corners. They told it in prisons and in gang headquarters. They told it in churches and in homes. They told it because it contained something profound about human nature, something profound about what happens when mercy confronts crime, something profound about what real power looks like. Mothers told it to their sons. Fathers told it to their daughters. Teachers told it to their students. The story became more than just a story. It became a moral lesson. It became a teaching tool. It became a way for people to understand what justice really meant. Bumpy Johnson lived for another 6 years after that night. He would die in 1968, in the same Lenox Lounge where he'd faced down Big Sam years before, his heart finally giving out from the weight of everything he'd carried. The heart attack was sudden, unexpected. One moment he was sitting at his corner table talking to friends, and the next moment he was gone. The city mourned him. Harlem mourned him. Thousands of people came to his funeral. People from all walks of life came to pay their respects, to say goodbye to a man who had meant something to them, who had changed their lives, who had shown them what real power looked like. But before he died, before his heart stopped beating, Bumpy had created a legend that transcended the usual gangster mythology. He'd shown that a truly powerful man didn't need to be the fastest gun in the room. A truly powerful man understood humanity. A truly powerful man could look at someone who'd wronged him and see not just an enemy, but a broken person who needed to face the consequences of their actions. A truly powerful man understood that the most devastating thing you could do to someone wasn't to end their life. The most devastating thing was to make them live with what they'd done. Raymond Cross spent the next 28 years in prison exactly as Bumpy had said he would. He served his entire sentence without incident. He was a model prisoner. He spent his time in the prison library, reading books, trying to educate himself, trying to understand how he'd become the kind of person who could kill someone. He worked in the prison kitchen. He taught literacy classes to other inmates. He spent his time trying to become something other than a murderer. He spent his time trying to understand Marcus Webb, trying to understand what he'd taken from the world, trying to come to terms with what he'd done. When he was released at age 56, Raymond was a broken man. He was weak from decades of imprisonment. He was damaged by the weight of his crime. He could barely function in the outside world. He moved to a small town upstate and tried to live quietly, tried to fade into nothing, tried to disappear from the world that he'd wronged so badly. Some people say he found religion and became a minister. Some say he spent his remaining years working with at-risk youth, trying to prevent them from making the same mistakes he'd made. Some say he simply suffered in silence, carrying the weight of Marcus Webb with him every single day until his dying breath. No one knows for certain what happened to him. He vanished, became a ghost, became a cautionary tale that parents told their children to warn them about the consequences of violence and rage. The Lenox Lounge was torn down decades ago. Harlem has changed. The world has changed. But the story of Bumpy Johnson and Raymond Cross remains. Remains because it contains a truth that transcends the specific circumstances, that transcends the particular time and place where it happened. The story remains because it shows what happens when a man chooses mercy over vengeance, when a man chooses consequence over revenge, when a man chooses to be something greater than his pain would allow him to be. When Bumpy Johnson walked into that police precinct with Raymond Cross, he sent a message that echoed through the decades, that continues to echo even now. He said that loyalty meant something. He said that every life mattered. He said that justice wasn't about making yourself feel better through violence. Justice was about making sure that people understood the weight of their choices and had to carry that weight for the rest of their lives. He said that the most powerful response to evil wasn't more evil. The most powerful response was to force someone to face themselves, to force them to understand what they'd done, to make them live with the consequences forever. Marcus Webb never got to see what Bumpy did with his killer. But if he could have looked down from wherever dead men go and seen Bumpy choose mercy over murder, choose consequence over revenge, choose to transform a moment of tragedy into a lesson about what really matters in this world, Marcus would have understood why Bumpy Johnson was the man he was. Marcus would have understood why people in Harlem didn't just respect Bumpy Johnson. They loved him. They loved him because he understood something that most men never figure out. The most devastating thing you can do to someone isn't to end their life. It's to make them live with what they've done. It's to force them to confront themselves and understand the full magnitude of their crimes. It's to let them go on breathing, let them go on existing, but make sure they never forget. Make sure they carry it with them every single day until they die. That's the kind of power that matters. That's the kind of strength that echoes through generations. That's the kind of wisdom that transforms a man from a criminal into something almost mythological, into something that people remember, something that people tell stories about, something that changes how people understand justice itself. That's why the story of Bumpy Johnson and Raymond Cross is still told today, still whispered in the streets of Harlem, still passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter. It's the story of a man who chose to be more than just a gangster. It's the story of a man who chose to be something greater. It's the story of a man who understood that real power isn't measured in bullets or butties. Real power is measured in lives changed, in lessons taught, in consequences enforced with mercy instead of malice. That's the Bumpy Johnson legacy. That's what separated him from every other criminal that has ever existed. That's why his name is still spoken with reverence in Harlem decades after his death. Why people still tell stories about him, why children still learn about him, why he's still relevant even now. In a completely different world, in a completely different time.